So the other day I was sitting in our living room with my child, and a moment of clarity completely stopped me in my tracks. So she's going over some lessons that she had that day and telling me about it. And she just paused in the middle and she was going over some. So there was a moment with my child the other day that completely stopped me in my tracks. I was listening to her tell me about this incident that was happening in one of her classes and this discussion they were having with the teacher. And she just stops in the middle of this conversation, right in the middle of the explanation of what the teacher was trying to convey, and said, yeah, okay, but how do we know it's actually true? And she actually says this to the teacher. I just sat there looking at her, a bit smug and proud. But mostly I was thinking, wow, that's not how we have school in America at all. I wouldn't have questioned the answer. I was taught and I guess, conditioned to believe whatever the teacher said. If I asked a question and the teacher gave me an answer, I just was groomed to accept whatever answer they gave me was true and to not push back and ask them to prove it. You find the answer, you circle it, you move on. But then in that moment with my child, it hit me. My kid's being taught something completely different here in the UK. And if I'm honest with you, I'm impressed but I'm also a little bit terrified. Just a quick side note, the last video that I did, it was a short on the US UK education, hit over 100,000 views, and a lot of you said, I'm curious about what that prompted this. Could you go a little bit deeper? Can you explain it? So that's this video for all of you that saw that short, and I'll link that video in the description box in case you haven't seen it. Because the realization that I was coming to when I was doing the walk and talk was, it's not about grades and hitting certain marks or passing GCSEs as you would talk about here in the UK. I think it's more about how we're taught to think, if we're really taught to think at all. So I personally grew up in the United States school system. Scantron sheets, standardized tests, lots of multiple choice questions, and a consistent underlying pressure to have the right answer, to have it very quickly. Not eventually, not always thoughtfully, just quickly, to be able to regurgitate at the drop of a hat, basically. And if you didn't, that was considered a failure. That not necessarily a failure, but definitely something that you had to work on, right? You were falling behind. So now I'm in the UK. We've been here a few years. So it's not like we didn't learn anything, right? We did. And I consider myself a fairly intelligent person, mainly because I acknowledge that I don't know everything, and my opinion definitely can be morphed and revamped and expanded based on the knowledge and experience, that I acquire throughout my life. But looking back, I can see now how school kind of felt more like training rather than education. And I think that's why I've been coming to this realization about the differences in the educational systems in the US versus the UK. We're trained in the American system to recall information, to perform under pressure, to follow instructions, and do as we're told, basically. And what I've been realizing and thinking about a lot lately is, were we being taught to think, or were we being taught or trained to function in a specific type of system, in a specific type of way? Because the system in America, up until very recently, worked very, very well. Your goal was to produce efficient, reliable, high-performing workers. Worker bees, basically. You show up, you do the task, you get the answer right, and you move on. And you don't really question the system that much. You never really push back unless you absolutely have to. And for years, probably more like decades, actually, I didn't question it. I just went with it because that's what you did, and that's what the rest of the society around me was doing. And then I met my partner, who is British, for those of you who don't know. And he started approaching things in a much more thoughtful and inquisitive way. And it just made me start to question some of the systems around me. And of course, then as I grew older, I started to experience more things, learn more things on my own that weren't just taught to me out of a textbook from like a decade before, I was even born. And I started to really think about everything that was happening and everything that I learned. Then I met my British partner. And everything started to shift because I saw how he was really inquisitive and he started to question everything, not just because he was, a foreigner in a new land and trying to learn the customs and everything, but also because he actually wanted to understand the fundamentals of it. He wanted to understand where it came from, why we did what we did, all of that, which was right up my alley because I happened to be in the same framework at that time, right? And I still am. I don't think I'm ever going to be out of it now. And what I was trying to explain to him at the time was that homework for us was about getting the right answer, passing the test, and moving on to the next grade. But what he explained to me was, from his perspective and his experience, homework is supposed to be about explaining your thinking and learning how to think critically in essays, in opinions, in debates. It's not like we didn't have those things in America, but they are definitely not encouraged. They're not something that is, a core fundamental structure of the education in the United States, at least from my experience growing up in New Jersey. But through various, incidents and conversations with him, and now living here in the UK, I realized that, you're really supposed to be, you're not just supposed to be taught, you're supposed to be educated. You're supposed to be educated to ask questions like, what do you think? Why do you think that? Can you defend that position? What is another perspective? Can you see that other person's perspective? Can you understand their argument? And I remember reading one of my child's assignments, and it actually said, there's no correct answer here. It's all your opinion, and you have to prove your opinion. Just reasoning. I mean, my mind was blown, man. Like, I couldn't fathom it. It's just something that I never really encountered in America that I can remember anyway, maybe once or twice in my entire 12 years of institutionalized education, not counting college. One of you actually commented on my last video, something along the lines of UK kids seem to mature faster because they're trusted to think for themselves. And I definitely have touched on this in previous videos because I've noticed that they are much more mature than their counterpart peers in the United States. And I thought it was kind of focused on the fact that you have a community that kind of helps raise them. They're much more independent about taking public transportation to and from school and things like that. But I think that this commenter has added a little bit more meat to that point of view, to that conversation. That's what it feels like. And there is actually a quote from J.D. Rockefeller that says, I want to create I'm totally butchering it now. I want to create a community of workers, not thinkers. I want to create a community of workers, not thinkers. Something along those lines. I'll put the actual quote up here because I definitely butchered it. But in the United States, there's an assumption that you have to be led constantly. So that's what a lot of people go into adulthood thinking. But here, the assumption is that kids at any age and adults are capable of forming their own thoughts and not just regurgitating someone else's or what they've been taught. That's enormously powerful. But for me as an American, a little uncomfortable. And I think that I've come to a little bit of a conclusion on it. See, when you teach your children to start questioning things, including yourself, I think I've come to a little bit of a conclusion on this. When you start to teach children to question everything, it doesn't stop at school. They question you. They question systems, they question authority, they question traditions, they question customs and cultural social norms. Things that you've never thought to challenge, or at least, I didn't until well into my adulthood. And as a parent, I can see how that can feel a little unsettling because now there's no script. Now you don't know exactly what to say. There's no clear path of do this, get this, be successful. In America, that we follow that to a T. But now, here in the UK, we're having conversations with our child about, well, what do you think success is even? Like, what do you want out of life? But that is crazy from my point of view, just in comparison to what I was taught, in my family structure and my school system. But that right there, that's where this connects into something a little bit bigger, in my opinion. Because if you're not just following a system, you have to define your own life. I mean, ultimately, that's where true freedom is, right? You own your work and your effort, whatever you put that effort into, good, bad, or ugly, no matter how it turns out. You own your values and you own the outcome of speaking about those values or pushing those values out there into the world. You have to own your perspective and you have to create your own definition of success. And that's a lot harder than just, filling in the little bubble on the Scantron sheet that I used to do. I'm not necessarily saying that one is good or one is bad, because there are positives that I've learned. There are good things that I've learned being in a system, learning how to work with others, not to be so combative, and we'll just cut that part out. So yeah, I came here to the UK. I came here to the UK thinking I was going to give my child a different lifestyle, which of course is true. But I didn't realize that I was actually, giving her a completely different way of thinking. Like, of course, that goes into the whole different lifestyle umbrella, but I guess I just didn't really the dots didn't really all connect for me just yet until recently. And I'm still kind of figuring out how I feel about that. I'm not opposed to it by any means. I want her to be strong. I want her to be independent. I want her to think for herself. And I do want her to challenge others' beliefs as well as her own. It's just something that makes me weary of any indoctrination or things that she was taught up until the point that we left, because she was in the school system for at least half of her life. She was in the American school system. But also, how to do it in a respectful, constructive, and positive way, proactive way, constructive way, I guess is where I'm going. So I'm curious about what you guys think on this. Did you feel like your education taught you to question things? Not whether or not you're indoctrinated or not whether or not they've glossed over certain parts of history, because those are very specific, and definitely having conversations with you all about education in general between the UK and the US, we've noticed that is definitely a commonality amongst most countries in their history. But do you feel like it taught you to question things no matter where you are? Or do you think it just taught you to get the right answer and move on? I have a feeling, based on our previous conversations, that this is probably one of those topics that people are going to feel very strongly about. But I'm encouraging the conversation because I want to learn, and I think this is really important. It affects our children. It affects the futures of our countries and our life. Not just our life, but life for future generations. And I think ultimately, most of us that have children in our lives want better, right? I think most people do. I actually have never met anyone that didn't, unless they had severe issues, but we're not going to get into that part. Anyway, let me know your story in the comments. Definitely want to hear your experiences. And yeah, speaking of being right, and yeah, I mean, also, do you think that this feeds into the hustle culture thing, which I've also been talking about a lot lately, especially between the US and the UK and the Americanization of other countries? That hustle culture might actually just be fear with better branding, right? I have another video coming out about that next week, but I think that maybe the school structures and how we educate versus teach your kids really feeds into that more than I ever realized anyway. So anyway, let me know your thoughts. Definitely subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see y'all in the next one.